The galaxy had known only one name for power for nearly 1,000 years, the Vraric Dominion. They were the species that no one challenged, the empire that crushed rebellion before it ever had a chance to breathe. Worlds bowed before their fleets. Armies surrendered at the mere whisper of their name. They were the unstoppable tide that swallowed entire star systems and rebuilt them in their image. To the Galactic Council, they were both sword and shield, too feared to be defied, too strong to be denied. But then came the day when the Dominion turned their eyes toward a small blue planet near the edge of mapped space. The planet had no ancient fleets, no great empire, no noble bloodlines of power. Its people were known as humans. The galaxy laughed when it heard of the Dominion's next conquest. But no one was laughing when the first Vraric fleet never returned. When the Dominion's warships arrived in the Sol system, the galaxy expected Earth to kneel. Every other species had. The Vraric had conquered civilizations with starfleets that spanned light years. Humanity had only been part of the Council for a single century, their technology growing fast but still considered primitive by Dominion standards. But what the galaxy didn't understand, what even the Dominion had failed to see, was that humanity's strength was never in its technology. It was in the way they stood when they were told to fall. It was in their refusal to accept the role written for them. And when the first Vraric soldiers landed on Mars, they expected an easy occupation. What they got was a war they would never forget. The opening strike was brutal. The Dominion did what it always did. Their warships blotted out the stars, their voice demanding surrender broadcast across every channel. They struck fast, burned colonies, shattered defenses. Human casualties were high in the first hours. Entire cities went dark. But beneath the ashes, something stirred. Terran Command didn't send surrender transmissions, they sent coordinates. Hidden shipyards lit up like sleeping giants opening their eyes. Deep under old Earth mountains, massive silos cracked open to reveal fleets no one knew existed. For years, humanity had watched the Dominion's slow expansion. And unlike other species, they didn't just hope the storm would pass. They prepared for it. In the heart of the Galactic Council chamber, delegates whispered in fear as reports flooded in. Every species knew how this story usually ended. The Dominion's iron boots crushing another world. But the humans didn't follow the script. Terran fleets launched not away from the Dominion, but straight at them. The Vraric's first invasion armada, boasting more than 100 warships, encountered something it had never faced before, humans who didn't care about the odds. On the outskirts of Mars, the first major battle began. The Vraric opened fire, their plasma cannons slicing through the black of space. But humanity didn't respond with standard formation warfare. They moved like chaos itself, breaking patterns no Vraric computer could predict. Terran ships didn't stand in neat lines. They struck like predators, cutting supply ships, isolating carriers, swarming larger vessels in coordinated bursts of fury. The Dominion's doctrine was built on control and fear. Humanity was built on defiance. For the first time in centuries, the unstoppable fleet staggered. On the ground, the fighting was even more vicious. Vraric soldiers towered over human marines, their armor layered in alien alloys, their weapons designed to intimidate and incinerate. But humans didn't fight like prey. They fought like a cornered pack of wolves. Cities became traps. Streets became kill zones. Civilians turned into resistance fighters overnight. The Vraric's overwhelming might became a disadvantage when they realized they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an entire species that refused to kneel. The Council, silent and trembling in their golden chambers, watched as transmission after transmission showed Dominion forces bogged down in a war they should have ended in days. Some delegates whispered that humanity would fall eventually. Others whispered something else, something they hadn't said about any other race in generations. What if they don't? The Vraric were not used to losing. Their empire had grown fat on easy victories. Their armies had been forged in the fires of conquest, but not tested in true war for centuries. Humanity was different. For humans, War was not a foreign concept. It was their oldest language. For millennia they had fought each other, clawing their way through history with fire and blood. Now, for the first time, they had a single enemy, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. In orbit, Terran Fleet Admiral Juno Mikhail stood on the bridge of the Resolute, watching the Dominion flagship maneuver into position. The enemy commander sent one final message. Humanity, surrender now and you may live to serve. Juno didn't answer with words. She answered with a railgun barrage that cracked through the flagship's shield like a hammer through glass. Across human comm channels, pilots cheered with feral laughter. For the first time in living memory, the Dominion's flagship fell back. The galaxy couldn't ignore it anymore. The unstoppable empire had just bled. Rumors spread like wildfire across trade networks, pirate bands, and council halls. If the Dominion could be hurt, they could be stopped. And if anyone was going to stop them, it would be humanity. The council panicked, not because they loved the Dominion, but because they feared what would happen when humans proved the impossible could be done. Old powers moved their fleets, unsure whether to join the fight or hide from the storm that was coming. The war escalated. The Dominion sent more ships. Humanity met them with more fire. Battles raged across asteroid belts, frozen moons, and space stations torn apart by gunfire. The Vraric fought with numbers, but humans fought with something the Dominion didn't understand: rage and unity. They used every inch of terrain, every scrap of metal, every trick they'd ever learned. They fought dirty, and they fought to win. Slowly, cracks spread through the Dominion's once perfect armor. One night, in the underground command bunker beneath New Kyoto, a young human soldier named Raphael sat with his squad, exhausted and bleeding but still alive. He looked at the message blinking on his wristband: another Vraric fleet approaching. "How many this time?" someone asked. Raphael smirked. "Doesn't matter. We've made bigger things bleed." Laughter rippled through the room, the kind that only comes from people who have nothing left to lose. As the war dragged on, the Dominion began to realize something horrifying. Every time they struck harder, the humans struck back harder still. Every Vraric victory cost them more than they could afford. Every Terran defeat was just another ember thrown into a growing fire. The Dominion's ships may have been forged from steel, but humanity's will was forged from something even harder. When the final battle came, it wasn't at Earth. It was at the Dominion's border. Humanity didn't just defend, they took the fight to the Empire itself. Terran fleets jumped into enemy space like a spear through the heart. Vraric worlds that had never seen resistance before now saw Terran drop pods raining from the sky. For centuries, the Dominion had been the nightmare. Now it was their turn to wake up screaming. The Council, once silent and afraid, found itself forced to choose. The galaxy was watching. The invincible had fallen to humanity, and the myth of Dominion power was shattered forever. By the time the war ended, the Vraric were no longer the rulers of the galaxy. Humanity stood, battered but unbroken, their banner flying over the ruins of what was once thought invincible. And somewhere deep in the void, the story began to spread. The story of the empire that ruled the stars. And the day it met humans. If you enjoyed this cinematic HFY sci-fi story about humanity, aliens, and the fall of an empire, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More stories of human defiance and galactic rebellion are coming soon. Humanity stands, and the galaxy will remember. The Dominion's first defeat sent shockwaves across the stars, but it also unleashed something far more dangerous than any fleet: human determination. The Vraric commanders had believed the first engagement was a fluke, a moment of luck against their invincible empire. But as their shattered armada limped back to the outer colonies, humanity wasn't retreating. They were already preparing for what came next. In orbit around Earth, shipyards blazed with activity. Vessels that had been kept in reserve or hidden in forgotten stations were pulled into the light. Soldiers who had never expected to fight outside their system now trained under burning floodlights. On the streets, civilians volunteered to dig trenches, build shelters, and prepare for the storm that everyone knew was coming. The Dominion was ancient, disciplined, and merciless. But humanity was something the galaxy had never fully understood. They were stubborn. At the same time, in the golden chamber of the Galactic Council, unease spread like cracks through glass. Delegates gathered under the shimmering dome, their voices rising in whispers that they pretended were strategy but sounded more like fear. The Chancellor of the Council, a scaled alien with a voice like gravel, slammed his staff against the floor. "This will end badly," he warned. "No one has ever defeated the Dominion. They don't stop." But others were no longer so sure. A small amphibian delegate leaned forward, eyes sharp. "No one else has ever been human," he said quietly. Those words hung in the air like a weapon. In the farthest reaches of space, Dominion fleets assembled. They were not used to resistance, let alone humiliation. The Vraric High Command poured resources into a retaliatory strike that would wipe out humanity's defiance before it spread. In their history, every war had been short, decisive, and ended with their banners hanging over conquered worlds. They didn't understand what it meant to fight a species that refused to kneel, no matter the cost. On the Resolute, Admiral Juno Mikhail watched the intelligence reports flicker on the command table. Dozens of Dominion battle groups were converging on the Sol system. Their ships outnumbered humanity's fleet 20-1. Her second-in-command exhaled slowly. "They are bringing everything," he muttered. Juno's face was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. "Good," she said. "Then we won't have to go looking for them." She turned her gaze to the stars outside the viewport. This wasn't about defending one planet anymore. This was about making sure the Dominion learned something they had forgotten a long time ago, what it felt like to bleed. The first waves hit hard. Dominion dreadnoughts descended upon Mars with their usual cold precision, unleashing orbital bombardments designed to crush resistance before it began. But this wasn't the same Mars they had attacked weeks earlier. Hidden rail platforms rose from beneath the red dust. Missile silos that had been built decades ago under the guise of mining operations roared to life. The Vraric learned too late that humanity had turned Mars into a fortress. For every barrage they sent, 10 came back. Dominion fleets expected fear. What they got was fury. On the ground, cities once silent now burned with resistance. Human soldiers moved through the streets like they had a score to settle, and in truth, they did. Entire neighborhoods became fortresses. Abandoned tunnels became traps. Civilian resistance groups coordinated with military forces so smoothly that Dominion soldiers couldn't tell where the front line began or ended. A Dominion war machine designed to crush formal armies found itself dragged into an ugly, relentless street war. Above the planet, the sky was a storm. Terran ships, far fewer in number, moved with unpredictable speed. Dominion formations relied on order. Human formations thrived on chaos. Every time the Vraric adjusted to one tactic, humans changed it. Fighter wings split, reformed, and struck at weak points the Dominion didn't even know they had. When their heavy cruisers advanced, human bombers disappeared into the shadow of Mars and reappeared behind their lines like phantoms. It wasn't elegance. It was brutality dressed as genius. And then came the first real moment of panic for the Dominion. One of their flagship carriers, a symbol of their strength, was struck by a human railgun round. It tore through the ship like a hot knife through paper, splitting its spine in two. The carrier exploded in a fireball that turned night into day. It wasn't just a loss. It was an insult. The Invincible had been made to bleed. Across human comm channels, pilots screamed and cheered as if their lungs would burst. "They can fall," someone shouted. "They can fall." The battle raged for hours, then days. Each Dominion push was met with human resistance so fierce it defied all reason. Soldiers with broken bones kept fighting. Damaged ships stayed in the fight even when their reactors were overheating. The Dominion expected surrender after every push. Instead, they were met with teeth and steel. Back in the council chamber, delegates leaned forward, stunned. No one had ever seen the Dominion stagger like this. Entire fleets had fallen to them without a single real fight. But humanity was turning a war into a nightmare the Dominion couldn't control. The Chancellor glared at the screen, his voice low. "If they win this, everything changes." He wasn't wrong. In the middle of it all, humanity changed too. Soldiers who had never known each other fought like family. Civilians carried ammunition to the front lines. Old grudges between colonies and Earth vanished overnight. For the first time in a long time, humanity wasn't fractured. It was one. And that unity burned brighter than any weapon. By the time the Dominion finally pulled its forces back to regroup, entire sections of their fleet were in ruins. Thousands of their soldiers were gone. Their leaders were furious. Their soldiers were shaken. And the galaxy, watching in silence, began to whisper the unthinkable. The invincible could lose. On the bridge of the Resolute, Juno stood surrounded by smoke and fire, her uniform torn and her hands still bleeding from the fight. Outside the viewport, wreckage drifted across the black like ghosts. "They'll be back," her second-in-command said quietly. Juno nodded, her jaw tight. "Good," she whispered. "We'll be ready." The galaxy didn't know it yet, but something had shifted forever. An empire built on fear had been cut. Humanity had done what no one else dared. And across distant star systems, people who had lived under Dominion rule began to lift their heads and imagine what it might look like to fight back. The invincible weren't invincible anymore. They had simply never met the right enemy. Now they had. The Dominion's defeat in the skies above Mars did not end the war. It only set the galaxy on fire. Word of the impossible spread faster than light, carried on whispers through trade routes, encrypted transmissions, and the secret channels of frightened civilizations. For centuries, the Vraric Dominion had ruled with an iron grip, and no one dared to believe they could ever be challenged. But now, every star knew their fleets had bled against a species the Council once dismissed as primitive. Humanity had struck at the unbreakable, and the cracks were beginning to show. In the shadow of Jupiter's moons, where Dominion fleets regrouped for their second strike, their high command burned with rage. Admiral K.A. Reth, a warlord who had conquered 50 worlds without ever suffering a defeat, stared at the battle reports with claws digging into the metal of the command table. Human ships were supposed to be uncoordinated. Their military was supposed to be fractured. And yet, these lesser creatures had humiliated an entire armada. "They don't know their place," Kaereth hissed to his advisors. "Then we will show them." His voice carried the cold certainty of a conqueror who had never needed to question his power. But buried beneath that certainty was something new. Something the Dominion hadn't felt in centuries. Unease. Back on Earth, humanity didn't waste a single second. Across every nation and colony, emergency transmissions turned into rallying cries. People who had once argued about borders, wealth, and politics now spoke only one language: war. Factories that once built civilian ships retooled overnight into war foundries. Orbital docks burned with the light of construction around the clock. Colonies that had spent years feuding came together without hesitation. Humanity, a species infamous for fighting itself, had united around something greater: survival. No leader had to command them. They moved like a single organism with fire in its veins. In the blackness of space, the Resolute and her battered fleet drifted among the wreckage of the first battle. Terran engineers moved like restless ants, patching torn hulls, recharging depleted railguns, welding armor over gaping wounds. Admiral Juno Mikhail stood at the observation deck, her hands still wrapped in bandages from the last fight. She had fought in dozens of campaigns, but nothing like this. Humanity wasn't just defending anymore. They were preparing to strike back. The Galactic Council met in emergency session under their gilded dome. Holographic images of the Dominion's defeat shimmered across the chamber. The Chancellor's tail thrashed in fury as he slammed his staff against the floor. "This is dangerous," he growled. "If the humans destroy the Dominion, the entire balance collapses." But his words fell on deaf ears. Delegates who had lived in fear for generations leaned forward, their eyes sharp. The myth of the invincible was crumbling. One lizard-like ambassador whispered to another, "If they can fight back, so can we." And just like that, the old power the Dominion held over the galaxy began to slip like sand through their claws. The Dominion returned sooner than anyone expected. Massive fleets poured out of jump space near Saturn like black serpents crawling from a pit. This time they didn't come with intimidation. They came with vengeance. Hundreds of ships, more than humanity had ever faced, advanced in perfect formation. They planned to strike fast, hard, and crush humanity's new fire before it spread. They had always believed wars were won by overwhelming power. They still hadn't learned who they were dealing with. When the alarms blared through Terran space, humanity didn't cower. They moved. Fleets jumped from Earth, Luna, Mars, and far-flung colonies. Civilian ships that had been refitted with armor and railguns joined the line. Mining rigs became troop carriers. Cargo haulers became missile barges. On every channel, a single message echoed through the stars: hold the line. The battle began in the cold rings of Saturn, under the pale blue shadow of the gas giant. Dominion dreadnoughts unleashed waves of plasma fire, carving through space with their usual precision. But Terran fleets didn't meet them in straight formations. They swarmed. Small, fast attack craft darted through the debris fields, weaving through the Dominion's tight formations like wolves tearing at a giant's ankles. Every time the Vraric tried to adjust their strategy, humanity shifted faster, like a current they couldn't contain. The Vraric admiral sat back on his throne-like chair, confident the human defenses would eventually collapse. But that confidence began to fracture when one Dominion battlecruiser after another went dark. The humans weren't just hitting their ships, they were dismantling their entire battle structure, cutting supply ships, severing communications, striking where the Dominion didn't think anyone would dare. For the first time, the fleet that had ruled the stars for centuries hesitated. On the ground, Titan Station became humanity's last shield. Terran Marines, armored and scarred, took positions in the cold shadow of the station's massive defense rings. Civilians were evacuated through frozen tunnels as soldiers loaded the last of the kinetic warheads. When the Dominion's ground forces landed, expecting another easy sweep, they found a nightmare waiting for them. The humans didn't fight with fear. They fought with fury. Every hallway, every airlock, every piece of ground was turned into a trap. One Vraric soldier, towering over his human opponent, sneered as he raised his plasma blade. But before he could strike, the human detonated an explosive charge that tore through the corridor, taking both of them with it. The Vraric didn't understand it. Their soldiers fought for empire. Humans fought like every breath was their last, and that made them terrifying. Up in orbit, Admiral Juno gave the order that would be remembered for generations. All fleets, converge on the flagship. Break their spine. Dozens of Terran vessels accelerated toward the Dominion command ship, weaving between plasma fire and burning wreckage. The Vraric flagship opened fire, confident its shields could withstand anything humanity threw at it. But humanity didn't throw one thing, they threw everything. Coordinated missile barrages, railgun fire, kamikaze runs from half-crippled freighters turned into battering rams. The Dominion flagship's shields failed, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the heart of their fleet was exposed. Across the Dominion fleet, something happened that their commanders had never experienced. Fear. Not strategic calculation. Not caution. Fear. They had always believed themselves untouchable. But in the cold of Saturn's orbit, as their flagship cracked under Terran fire, they realized they weren't. The Galactic Council chamber erupted as the live feed came through. Delegates stood, some in shock, some in awe. A few even smiled for the first time in their lives. The Chancellor barked for silence, but his voice no longer commanded the room like it once did. The myth of the Dominion's invincibility had been shattered before their eyes. Down on Titan, a young Marine named Cade wiped blood from his face, staring at the sky as a Dominion cruiser burned up in the atmosphere like a falling star. "They are not gods," he whispered. "They are just next." Around him, soldiers who had been fighting with nothing left in their veins but stubborn will lifted their heads, shoulders straightening. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving something to the galaxy. By the time the battle ended, Dominion ships were either retreating or burning. Saturn's rings glowed faintly with the wreckage of a fleet that had once been called unbeatable. Humanity stood, battered and blooded but still standing. And for the first time in galactic history, the unstoppable empire had been stopped, twice. On the Resolute, Juno leaned against the command rail, her voice hoarse but steady. "They'll bring more," her XO said. "Then we'll break more," she answered quietly. Outside the viewport, the wreckage of the Dominion flagship drifted through the void like a broken crown. The galaxy had changed. Fear no longer belonged only to the weak. It now lived inside the hearts of the Dominion themselves. And across distant star systems, whispers grew louder. The invincible weren't invincible anymore. Humanity had made sure of it. The wreckage of the Second Great Battle drifted silently through Saturn's orbit like a graveyard of steel. Blackened Dominion ships spun slowly through the void, their once proud insignias cracked and charred by Terran railguns. Titans of war that had once brought entire civilizations to their knees were now little more than burning scrap, a floating monument to the moment when the galaxy's balance of power began to tilt. Across every corner of human space, from the icy domes of Europa to the crowded streets of New Kyoto, people stopped to watch the transmissions. They're invincible. Dominion had been defeated again. And this time, the galaxy was paying attention. In the golden chamber of the Galactic Council, silence fell like a hammer. Holographic projections of the destroyed Vraric flagship shimmered in the air. Delegates who had once spoken in cautious whispers now leaned forward with wide, calculating eyes. The Chancellor, furious, slammed his staff against the floor, trying to regain control of the room. "Do not be fooled," he growled. "The Dominion will strike back harder than ever. Humanity's defiance will burn worlds." But even as he spoke, he saw it. Something he hadn't seen in centuries. The fear in the chamber no longer belonged to the Dominion. It belonged to them. The old order was cracking, and every delegate in that room could feel it. In the cold depths of space, the Vraric Dominion gathered their warlords for an emergency council of their own. Admiral Kaereth stood before the High Command, his clawed hands trembling in fury as he faced the Great War Council of the Dominion. Never in 1,000 years had their fleets been defeated twice by the same enemy. "They are only human," he snarled. "They are nothing compared to us. They don't have the numbers. They don't have the centuries of conquest behind them. They are weak." But the room stayed quiet. No one dared to say what they all knew. The humans had done what no one else had. They had turned the Dominion's arrogance into a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Back in human space, war preparations moved like a living storm. The United Terran Fleet had become something more than a defense force. It was now the spearpoint of a rebellion against a galactic fear that had lasted for generations. Shipyards in orbit around Mars and Luna thundered day and night. Civilian vessels were stripped down and reforged into warships. Old colonies that had been distant and divided for decades now pooled resources without question. Humanity had always been infamous for its chaos, for its endless infighting, for the way they tore at each other over the smallest of things. But when faced with a common enemy, they united in a way no Dominion strategist had accounted for. They didn't need an emperor or a council to command them. They just needed a reason. And the Dominion had given them one. On the Resolute, Admiral Juno Mikhail stood on the bridge, watching the repair drones crawl over the hull like fireflies. Her fleet was battered, held together with welding patches and willpower, but it still stood. Around her, officers moved like ghosts, tired, scarred, but alive. "They'll be back," her XO said quietly. She didn't need to reply. Everyone on that bridge knew the next storm would be worse. Across the Dominion border, the enemy was moving. Entire sectors that had once remained quiet were now alive with the hum of war. Their retaliation was coming, not just with one fleet, but with their entire armada. They wanted to make Earth a message. They wanted to burn the blue planet to ash so no one else in the galaxy would dare rise again. Kaeretha's voice echoed through Dominion Command. "We will crush their defiance. We will erase their name." But Kaereth, for all his rage, had never faced a species like this before. He did not yet understand that humans didn't break the way others did. The third invasion came like a tidal wave. The Vraric Dominion didn't just bring ships this time. They brought everything. Hundreds of warships emerged from jump space near Neptune, their hulls glowing like black suns against the stars. Dreadnoughts, supercarriers, war platforms the size of cities. The Dominion wanted to drown humanity in sheer numbers. On Earth, sirens screamed through every major city. Military networks lit up like wildfire. But the humans did not panic. They moved like a single heartbeat. Civilians were evacuated underground. Orbital defense platforms activated in synchronized waves. Fleet groups jumped into formation like pieces on a chessboard that had already been set. This time, humanity didn't wait for the enemy to come to them. Task Force Hammer, a coalition of Terran and colonial fleets, jumped to intercept the Vraric Armada at the edge of Neptune's orbit. It was the largest battle in human history. Thousands of ships faced thousands more in a black sea lit by burning plasma and railfire. Dominion ships advanced in perfect, rigid lines, their cannons roaring. Terran ships moved like chaos incarnate. Fighters swarmed like wasps, slipping through gaps in enemy formations. Old freighters, barely held together, rammed Dominion frigates in suicidal strikes that cracked their shields. Railgun fire cut through the void like spears of light. Ka Reth watched from his flagship, sneering as Terran ships fell by the hundreds. "You cannot win," he whispered to himself. But then something unexpected happened. Humanity didn't retreat. They tightened. The longer the battle went on, the more their fury grew. Terran ships that should have fled instead dove straight into the Dominion's core formations. The Dominion had expected panic. They got fury instead. Down on the lunar surface, long-range artillery platforms fired volley after volley into the void, their trails glowing like comets. Civilians on Earth watched the battle from deep shelters, holding their breath as blue icons on their screens. Terran ships surrounded the enemy's vanguard like wolves circling a wounded beast. On Mars, volunteers rushed ammunition to orbital cannons while military units moved with silent precision. This was no longer a war for survival. It was personal. The Galactic Council watched the live broadcast in horrified fascination. They had seen the Dominion crush dozens of civilizations. They had watched entire planets burn. But now they watched something new. The Invincible struggling against a species that refused to kneel. Delegates whispered furiously, old alliances crumbling in real time. "If they win this," one whispered, "the galaxy will never be the same." Above Neptune, the battle reached its breaking point. A Terran dreadnought named Iron Dawn, already crippled, turned itself directly toward Ka Retha's flagship. It had no shields left. Half its crew was dead. But its captain gave the order anyway. Engines roared, pushing the burning vessel into a collision course. Dominion interceptors swarmed to stop it, but it was too late. The Iron Dawn slammed into the flagship's shield bubble, punching through with a final railgun volley. The detonation lit up the void like a second sun. On the Dominion bridge, Ka Reth was thrown from his command chair as alarms howled. For the first time in his life, he saw terror in his crew's eyes. The humans hadn't just won. They had taught the unthinkable. They had hurt the Dominion's heart. Across the Terran comm channels, a single voice broke through the chaos. "We just cracked their flagship." Cheers erupted through every ship, every trench, every base. Humanity's fleet, bleeding and burning, surged forward like a living storm. By the time the battle ended, space around Neptune was nothing but wreckage. Human ships floated alongside burning Dominion hulks. Ka Retha's flagship was in ruins, his fleet scattered. Humanity had paid a terrible price, but they had stood against the strongest empire in the galaxy 3 times and still remained on their feet. And the galaxy was no longer the same. In the council chamber, silence reigned. The Chancellor looked at the shattered image of the Dominion flagship on the hologram and knew what it meant. The old age of fear was dying. On the Resolute, Juno Mikhail stood on the bridge, watching the burning horizon beyond Neptune. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply whispered, "They'll never forget this." Around her, officers stood at their stations, too tired to cheer, but with eyes blazing like stars. Across distant worlds, whispers turned to shouts. The Dominion wasn't invincible anymore. Humanity had proven it again and again. And the galaxy, for the first time in centuries, started to believe in something it had forgotten long ago. Hope. The fires of Neptune's orbit still burned when the news reached the galaxy. Entire Dominion fleets, once believed to be unstoppable, were gone, reduced to drifting husks and flaming debris fields scattered across the void. The Vraric flagship, a symbol of terror for centuries, lay cracked in half, its once mighty hull now silent. What was supposed to be a final, crushing lesson for humanity had become the greatest humiliation in Dominion history. Across the galaxy, the whispers that had once been faint now thundered like a rising storm. The invincible have fallen again. For the first time in living memory, the Dominion bled not once, not twice, but 3 times, and the whole galaxy had seen it happen. In the golden chamber of the Galactic Council, chaos replaced the silence. Delegates who had always spoken in fearful whispers now shouted across the floor. Some demanded intervention to stop the war before it spread. Others demanded their worlds break free from the Council entirely. The Chancellor pounded his staff against the floor, his voice rising like a whip. This cannot be allowed to continue. If the Dominion falls, everything collapses. But his threats no longer carried the weight they once had. Delegates who had spent centuries hiding behind the Dominion's shadow now saw something new, a light they didn't expect. Humanity's defiance was not just a battle. It was a spark igniting something far bigger. In the darkness beyond the frontier, the Dominion reeled. The Vraric War Council gathered in a chamber buried deep beneath their capital world, their faces carved with rage. Admiral Kaereth, his flagship shattered and his legend broken, stood before them with his head lowered. He spoke through clenched teeth. "They are humans," he hissed. "They are young, undisciplined. They should have fallen." The High Warlord slammed a claw against the table, shaking the entire chamber. But they did not. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Vraric were forced to confront something they didn't understand, an enemy who refused to break. Back in human space, the aftermath of the battle was both victory and tragedy. Thousands of Terran ships drifted damaged but alive. Entire fleets bore scars from the fight. Earth's orbital shipyards worked without rest, pulling in broken vessels, patching hulls, replacing cannons, and sending them back into the void. Hospitals overflowed with soldiers who had stared into the abyss and survived it. Civilians delivered food, wrapped wounds, and buried their dead side by side with soldiers. Humanity was exhausted, blooded, but their spirit burned brighter than ever. For every life lost, 5 more people volunteered to stand in their place. On the Resolute, Admiral Juno Mikhail stood before the great viewport, staring at the debris field that stretched out like a black sea of shattered metal. Her face was pale and her hands were still wrapped in blood-stained bandages, but her gaze was steady. The XO approached slowly, his voice low. "The Dominion will return," he said. "They'll bring their full weight this time." Juno nodded without turning her eyes from the void. "Good," she whispered. "We'll give them the same answer we've given them every time." Far from human space, in places the Dominion had ruled through fear alone, something extraordinary began to happen. Worlds that had been silent for generations began to stir. Old resistance cells, crushed long ago, whispered to life. Races who had grown used to keeping their heads down began sending encrypted messages to one another. It wasn't just admiration. It was calculation. If humanity could stand against the Vraric 3 times, maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to live in fear anymore. Meanwhile, the Dominion began to do what empires always do when their power is questioned. They overreacted. Massive fleets were recalled from the outer sectors. Garrisons were strengthened. Entire colonies were locked down. Warlords issued harsh decrees, hoping to crush whispers before they became fire. But their terror no longer sounded like the voice of gods. It sounded like the voice of something afraid. And the galaxy could smell it. Back on Earth, beneath the steel canopy of the Terran Defense Command, a different kind of war was being planned. Not just one of survival, but one of liberation. For years, humanity had fought with its back against the wall. Now, the wall was gone. On giant holotables, Dominion supply routes blinked red. Weak points were identified. Vulnerable colonies, places where other races had lived under the Dominion boot, were marked for strikes. Humanity wasn't just going to defend anymore. They were going to strike back. Juno Mikhail stood before her fleet commanders, her voice rough but strong. They think they own the stars. They've ruled through fear, through stories about how they can't be defeated. We just rewrote those stories. They're not gods. They're just another enemy. And we are done being prey. Her words were simple, sharp, and heavy. Every commander in that room carried exhaustion in their bones, but none of them hesitated when she gave the final order, "We take the fight to them." The first strike fell on a Dominion outpost on the fringe of their empire, a place that had watched countless worlds burn but had never known war itself. Terran ships appeared out of jump space like shadows, fast and silent. Before the Vraric defenders could even comprehend what was happening, the outpost's command structure was in flames. Terran Marines swept through the facility like ghosts, cutting through soldiers who had spent lifetimes fighting only the weak. The Dominion had spent centuries conquering. They had never learned how to defend. Across the galaxy, broadcast signals crackled to life. For the first time in history, someone was attacking the Dominion on its own soil. Not pirates. Not rebels hiding in the shadows. But a fleet flying openly under the Terran banner. It wasn't a secret strike. It was a message to everyone still living in chains. They can be hurt. The Galactic Council watched in shock. Some delegates called humanity reckless. Others called them dangerous. But many began to lean forward, their hands clenched, their hearts racing. They had never seen anyone push the Dominion like this and live. In the Dominion capital, Kaereth slammed his claws into the war table, his voice shaking with fury. "We will crush them," he roared. "We will burn their world to the core." But as he looked around the room, he saw it, the fear in the eyes of his officers. It was the same fear the Council once felt. The same fear that had once made entire worlds bow without a fight. Only now, it wasn't the galaxy that feared. It was the Dominion. Back on the Resolute, Juno stood with her crew as the captured Dominion outpost burned in the distance. Her people were tired. Her ships were scarred. But their resolve was iron. The Dominion had spent centuries making the galaxy fear them. Humanity had shattered that fear and replaced it with something far more dangerous: hope. And on world after world, in the dark places where whispers turned to quiet prayers, oppressed races began to rise. First a few, then hundreds, then thousands. Their message was the same. The Vraric are not invincible. They never were. They just hadn't faced humans yet. The next war wouldn't be just between the Dominion and Earth. It would be a war for the soul of the galaxy. And for the first time in centuries, the stars themselves seemed to tilt, not toward the empire of fear, but toward the defiant fire of humanity. The Dominion's empire stretched like a black scar across the stars, but after 3 crushing defeats and the first strikes against their own territories, that scar had started to bleed. What was once a name spoken in terror was now whispered in uncertainty. The galaxy had felt it, the shift. For centuries, no one had dared to imagine a day when the Vraric could lose. And now, that day had arrived again and again at the hands of one species: humanity. But while the galaxy celebrated in quiet corners, while oppressed civilizations began to whisper of rebellion, both sides knew the war was far from over. The Dominion was not broken yet. And humanity had no illusions about the storm that was gathering in the dark. On the Dominion capital world, beneath towering black spires that had never known damage, the High Warlord sat in a war council unlike any other in their history. Kaereth knelt before him, his armor cracked, his claws still stained from Neptune. He had lost his fleet and his pride, but he had not lost his hatred. "They are not like the others," Kaereth growled, voice low and bitter. "They do not fear us. The more we strike, the stronger they become." The High Warlord's eyes narrowed, his voice soft and cold. "Then we will show them what it means to defy gods." Orders were given. Entire Dominion sectors that had been untouched for centuries began to burn with war preparations. If they could not terrify humanity into surrender, they would drown them in the weight of the Empire itself. Back on Earth, the mood was different. The war had changed everything. The planet that had once argued over borders, resources, and politics now spoke with one voice. Entire cities had been converted into supply hubs. Shipyards orbited every major colony like steel constellations. The people had learned to live with war in their bones, but it wasn't despair that filled them, it was purpose. Humanity no longer saw itself as prey. They were the storm that the galaxy had underestimated. And now, they were not standing alone. Across council space, small fleets began to move. Species who had hidden in the shadows for centuries quietly aligned their routes with Terran ships. Smugglers, rebel groups, and old resistance cells joined the growing rebellion. Humanity's war had become something bigger. In the command chamber of the Resolute, Admiral Juno Mikhail stood before a new kind of war map. It wasn't just one front anymore. Red Dominion markers blinked across multiple systems, but beside them glimmered green and blue, symbols of Allied uprisings. Juno's XO stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "I never thought I'd see the day," he muttered. "They're actually rising." Juno's eyes were hard. "They were always waiting," she replied. "They just needed someone to swing first." But the Dominion was not idle. Their final counterstroke began at the edge of the Orion Arm, where their main war fleets massed in a single, monstrous formation. Thousands of warships, more than humanity had ever faced, formed a dark line stretching across light years. This wasn't another invasion. This was extermination. They weren't coming to conquer Earth. They were coming to erase it. When the alarms went off across human space, no one panicked. This time, there was no surprise. The enemy had given them 3 wars to learn. The response was immediate, coordinated, and fierce. Fleets launched from every colony, every station, every shipyard. Volunteer fighters from dozens of alien races joined them. Mining vessels converted into bombers. Transport ships welded with armor plating. Drones and missiles built in underground bunkers. Humanity didn't have the Dominion's numbers, but they had something the enemy would never understand, a galaxy that no longer feared them. The final battle began in the void between stars. The Dominion armada surged forward like a black tidal wave. Their dreadnoughts burned like suns, their carriers releasing endless swarms of fighters. Ka Reth stood on his new flagship, his eyes locked on the distant blue dot of Earth. "Burn it," he ordered. But humanity didn't wait for the fire to come. They met the storm head-on. The Terran fleet roared into the darkness like a pack of wolves. Railguns fired in synchronized waves, tearing into Dominion flanks. Swarms of Terran fighters broke their formations and dove into enemy lines with surgical precision, cutting through carrier groups before they could stabilize. The enemy's perfect, disciplined structure became a weakness. Humans fought like a storm, unpredictable, relentless, alive. Allied fleets joined them from the flanks, small and scattered but burning with defiance. Dominion commanders, used to crushing the weak, now found themselves drowning in a war they couldn't control. Above the battlefield, the Resolute spearheaded the assault. Juno stood at the helm, her voice steady as the deck shook under impacts. "Target their command ships. Break their spine," she ordered. The Dominion responded with overwhelming force, unleashing a barrage that could have cracked moons in half. Terran shields burned. Entire fleets were lost in flashes of white light. But for every Terran ship that fell, 10 more hurled themselves into the fight. Humanity wasn't fighting for territory. They were fighting for the right to exist. On the surface of the moon, massive defense platforms came alive, firing kinetic slugs the size of skyscrapers into the void. Every impact sent shockwaves through Dominion formations. Old orbital defense systems, relics from forgotten wars, were reawakened and turned on the invaders. Civilians across Earth huddled underground, not in terror, but in quiet, iron resolve. They were not helpless. They were part of something larger. In the heart of the battle, a Dominion dreadnought, the largest ever built, cut through human lines like a blade. Its cannons burned through entire fleets. Its shields gleamed like black glass. Ka Reth, standing on its bridge, could almost taste victory. But then, something shifted. A dozen Terran destroyers broke formation and hurled themselves at the dreadnought. Their captains knew they wouldn't survive. They didn't care. Their impact ripped a hole through the monster's shields, opening it up like a wound. A single message echoed through the comm channels: for Earth. And then came the strike. A Terran battleship, one of the oldest in service, dived straight into the gap and fired everything it had. The dreadnought cracked like bone. Kareth roared as alarms filled his bridge. His crew panicked as flames burst through the control deck. Impossible, he hissed. But it wasn't impossible. It was human. Around the Dominion Armada, panic spread like a disease. Their fleets, built on the myth of invincibility, were watching that myth burn. The Allied fleets surged forward, emboldened by the sight of the dreadnought's death. Railguns thundered. Missiles screamed. Plasma fire lit the void like a newborn star. Humanity, outnumbered and blooded, was winning. In the council chamber, the Chancellor stood in silence as the battle feed filled the room. For centuries, the Dominion had ruled through terror, and the Council had obeyed out of fear. Now, they watched as the galaxy turned. The age of the Vraric, someone whispered, is over. The final blow came when the Dominion's command ship was surrounded by a mixed fleet of Terran and Rebel vessels. Kareth stood on the bridge, staring at the storm closing in. He saw the Terran flagship, the Resolute, breaking through his last line, fire trailing behind it like the blade of a god. No, he whispered. But it was too late. The Dominion's flagship exploded in a storm of fire and shattered steel, lighting up the void like a second sun. Across every channel, the same words echoed from Terran voices, from alien rebels, from every ship still standing, they are down. In that moment, something ancient and terrible cracked across the galaxy. The fear that had held countless species in chains for centuries shattered. The Dominion's fleets, once the unbreakable wall of power, broke apart like waves against a rock. Their ships fled. Their colonies went dark. Their empire began to collapse. Back on Earth, as the skies cleared and the last enemy signals faded, Admiral Juno Mikhail stood on the scarred deck of the Resolute. The ship had lost half its guns. The hull was cracked, but it was still flying. Around her, her crew was silent, exhausted, and covered in soot. Juno looked out into the stars where the Dominion's flagship had burned. She whispered, "It's over." But even as the celebrations began across Earth, Luna, and Mars, she knew it wasn't just a human victory. It was something bigger. All across the galaxy, oppressed species were rising, throwing off chains they had worn for generations. The Dominion would not return. Not because they couldn't, but because no one would fear them again. Humanity had faced the gods of the galaxy and shown they could bleed. They had united a galaxy not through diplomacy or treaties, but through defiance, sacrifice, and fire. This wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new age. And as the stars burned quietly in the distance, the Terran flag flew high, a symbol of something the galaxy had forgotten long ago. Not power, not dominance, but hope. If you enjoyed this cinematic HFY sci-fi story about humanity, aliens, the Galactic Council, and the fall of an empire, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More stories of defiance, courage, and humanity's fire among the stars are coming soon. Humanity stands. The galaxy will remember.